The courtroom fell silent as the arrogant judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the timid teenage girl standing before him. His voice dripped with condescension as he spoke. "Young lady, do you even understand what's happening here?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "This isn't some school debate. This is a real court. And in real courts, we don't waste time with people who don't belong." The teenager, no older than 16, stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just stood there, calm and composed, even as the judge continued to humiliate her. "You think you can just walk in here and act like a lawyer? That's cute," the judge scoffed. "Tell me, do you even know what a subpoena is? Or are you just hoping to win this case with some big puppy dog eyes?" The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter. The other lawyers smirked, the audience whispered, and even the bailiff shook his head. But then, the girl lifted her gaze. And the moment she spoke, the room changed. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "Under Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, a subpoena is a court order demanding the presence of a witness or the production of documents. And considering the prosecution failed to present one properly, their evidence should be inadmissible." Silence. The judge's smirk faded. The attorneys stopped whispering. Even the bailiff straightened up. No one expected her to actually know the law, let alone recite it better than most lawyers in the room. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. And that's when the truth started to unravel. 2 weeks earlier, the courtroom had been the last place anyone expected to see Sophie Daniels. She was the quiet girl in school, the one who sat in the back of the class, rarely speaking unless called upon. She wasn't popular. She wasn't a troublemaker. She was just Sophie. But that all changed when her father was accused of a crime he didn't commit. It started with a single phone call in the middle of the night. Sophie had woken up to the sound of her mother sobbing, her hands shaking as she clutched the phone. Her father had been arrested. They said he stole money from the company he worked for, but Sophie knew that was impossible. He wasn't just honest. He was the kind of man who left extra money at the store if he thought the cashier undercharged him. By morning, their entire world had flipped upside down. Her mother barely spoke. Their house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and empty. The lawyers they could afford were dismissive, treating her father like just another case file. Sophie listened as they mumbled about a plea deal, about how they should just accept it and move on. Move on. Her father was innocent. How could they just accept it? That night, while her mother cried in the bedroom, Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her father's case file spread before her. She read every page, every accusation, every so-called proof the company had against him. And then she read them again. And that's when she saw it. A mistake. A mistake so obvious it made her heart pound. If she was right, no, she knew she was right, then the entire case against her father would fall apart. But who would listen to her? She was just a kid. So she made a decision. If no one else would defend him properly, then she would. The next morning, she walked into the lawyer's office with a stack of papers in her hands and explained everything she had found. She expected him to be impressed. Instead, he smirked, leaned back in his chair, and waved her off. "Listen, kid, I know you love your dad, but leave the lawyering to the professionals." Her stomach twisted in frustration. No one was taking this seriously. No one was fighting for him. So, she did something crazy. She found a legal loophole that allowed family members to present arguments in special circumstances. She studied every law she could find, every case similar to her father's. And when the day came, she walked into that courtroom, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. And that's how she found herself standing in front of an arrogant judge, being mocked in front of an entire courtroom. She had expected people to laugh. She had expected doubt. But what she didn't expect was for her to shock them all. The air in the courtroom was thick with silence. The arrogant judge, who just moments ago had been mocking her, now stared at Sophie with narrowed eyes. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat as if trying to regain control of the situation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp. "What did you just say?" Sophie didn't flinch. "Your Honor, I said that the prosecution's evidence should be inadmissible because they failed to properly issue a subpoena. According to Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure." "I know what Rule 45 is," the judge snapped, clearly irritated. Sophie tilted her head slightly. "Then you also know that if the subpoena was issued incorrectly, The evidence they gathered because of it is unlawful and should be thrown out. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. The other lawyers in the courtroom whispered among themselves. One of the attorneys at the prosecution table frowned, flipping through his notes. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to look nervous. The judge let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. I don't know where you think you are, Miss Daniels, but this is not some high school debate club. You don't just throw around legal jargon and expect me to take you seriously. Sophie clenched her fists. Then take the law seriously, because it's right there in black and white. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some of the people who had been smirking earlier now looked intrigued. The prosecution's lead attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the tension. She's right. The entire courtroom turned toward the prosecution's table. One of the younger attorneys, a man in his mid-30s, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The subpoena was filed incorrectly. The evidence collected under it should be inadmissible. The judge shot him a sharp look. You mean to tell me that the prosecution actually messed up? The attorney hesitated before nodding. Yes, Your Honor. A stunned silence filled the room. Sophie watched as the judge's face turned red. He was clearly furious, not just at the prosecution, but at the fact that a teenage girl had caught a mistake that an entire team of lawyers had overlooked. But instead of admitting he was wrong, the judge scoffed and waved his hand. Fine, that piece of evidence will be removed. But that doesn't change the fact that the defendant is still facing serious charges. And you, Miss Daniels, are not a lawyer. He leaned forward, his eyes cold. You may have gotten lucky this time, but I suggest you stop playing games before you embarrass yourself. Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to argue, to tell him that this wasn't a game, that her father's life was at stake. But before she could respond, the judge banged his gavel. Court is adjourned for today. With that, he stood and walked out, his robe billowing behind him. Sophie stood frozen as the courtroom erupted into whispers. Some people looked at her with curiosity, others with annoyance. But one thing was clear. She had just made an enemy out of the judge. Her mother rushed to her side, gripping her arm tightly. Sophie, what did you just do? Sophie swallowed. I did what the lawyers wouldn't. Her mother shook her head, her face pale. Sweetheart, I love you, and I know you want to help your father. But that judge, he's powerful. If he doesn't like you, he could make things worse. Sophie bit her lip. She knew her mother was right. But if the system was already unfair, then what choice did she have? Before she could say anything, a voice called out from behind her. That was impressive. She turned to see the younger attorney from the prosecution's table. He held out a hand. Michael Carter. I have to say, I've seen seasoned lawyers miss what you just caught. Sophie hesitated before shaking his hand. I just read the case files. He smiled slightly. Yeah, well, most people don't bother. He glanced toward the empty judge's bench. Listen, I don't know how you got permission to represent your father, but if you're serious about this, you're going to have to be careful. Judge Reynolds doesn't like being proven wrong. Sophie exhaled slowly. Noted. Michael hesitated before handing her a business card. If you need anything, advice, research, someone to double-check your arguments, call me. I may be on the other side of this case, but I respect what you're trying to do. Sophie took the card, surprised. Thank you. He nodded before walking away. Her mother touched her arm gently. Sophie, are you sure about this? Sophie stared at the empty judge's seat. I don't have a choice. The next morning, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, poring over legal books and case files. She barely heard the sound of the doorbell ringing. Her mother answered, and moments later, her voice carried through the house. Sophie, you have a visitor. Sophie frowned, closing her book as she walked to the door. And then she froze. Standing in their living room, with a smug smile on his face, was Judge Reynolds. He looked down at her like a predator studying its prey. Miss Daniels, he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. I thought I'd stop by personally. After all, if you want to play lawyer, you should understand just how dangerous the game can be. Sophie's stomach twisted. She knew this wasn't just a casual visit. This was a warning. Sophie felt her breath hitch in her throat. Judge Reynolds stood in her living room, his sharp eyes scanning the house as if he were inspecting a crime scene. His presence alone sent a chill down her spine. Her mother, standing beside her, looked just as shocked. Judge Reynolds, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice unsteady. The judge gave a slow, deliberate smile. "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by for a little chat." His gaze settled on Sophie. "I have to say, Miss Daniels, you certainly made quite the impression in my courtroom yesterday." Sophie squared her shoulders. She refused to let him see how nervous she was. "I was just pointing out the law, Your Honor." The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "The law." He stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "Let me explain something to you, young lady. Courtrooms aren't about who can recite the most legal codes. They're about power. And right now, you're stepping on the toes of people who have far more of it than you do." Her mother stiffened. "Is that a threat?" Judge Reynolds held up his hands in mock innocence. "A threat? Of course not. Just advice." He turned his gaze back to Sophie, his smirk deepening. "I know you think you're clever, but this isn't a fairy tale where the smart little girl wins in the end. This is real life. And in real life, people like you don't change anything." Sophie's hands clenched at her sides. "We'll see about that." The judge's smirk faltered for a brief second. He hadn't expected her to push back. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if she were exhausting him. "You want to keep playing this game? Fine. But I'll warn you, Miss Daniels. Keep this up, and you're going to find out just how unforgiving the legal system can be." With that, he turned and strode toward the door. Her mother called after him, her voice shaking. "Stay away from my daughter." The judge paused, looking back over his shoulder. "That depends on her." And then he was gone. The moment the door closed, Sophie felt her mother's grip tighten around her arm. "Sophie, this has to stop." Sophie turned to face her. "Mom, I can't." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Sweetheart, he's dangerous. You saw how he looked at you. He doesn't just want to win. He wants to crush you. If he's willing to show up at our house, imagine what else he could do." Sophie swallowed hard. She knew her mother was right. Judge Reynolds wasn't just arrogant, he was ruthless. But if she backed down now, what would happen to her father? Who would fight for him? She met her mother's gaze. "I know you're scared, but if we don't stand up for Dad, no one will." Her mother wiped her eyes and sighed. "I just don't want to lose you too." Sophie hugged her tightly. "You won't." But deep down, Sophie knew things were only going to get harder. Later that night, Sophie sat at her desk, flipping through case law after case law. She had to find a new angle, a way to prove that the accusations against her father were false. Her mind kept drifting back to Judge Reynolds' visit. He had been so confident, so sure that she would back down. But why? That's when something clicked. If he was that desperate to stop her, then maybe, just maybe, there was something bigger going on. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she searched for Judge Reynolds' case history. She scrolled through years of rulings, legal articles, anything she could find. And then she saw it. A case from 5 years ago. A different company. A different accused employee. But almost exactly the same charges. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just about her dad. This had happened before. She clicked open the case file, scanning every detail. The employee had been accused of the same kind of fraud. The same kind of evidence had been used against him. And who had presided over the case? Judge Reynolds. Her stomach turned. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. She needed more proof. She needed to find out who else had been affected. Sophie reached for her phone and hesitated. Michael Carter. He had given her his business card. Told her to call if she needed help. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. It rang once. Twice. Then, hello. She gripped the phone tighter. "Mr. Carter, it's Sophie Daniels." A pause. Then, "Sophie? It's late. What's wrong?" She swallowed hard. "I think I just found something huge." Another pause. Then his voice dropped. "Serious? What do you mean?" She turned back to her computer screen, staring at the old case file. "I think Judge Reynolds has done this before." Michael's voice was sharp. "Stay where you are. I'm coming over." Sophie hung up and exhaled, her mind racing. She had thought she was just fighting for her dad. But now she realized she might be about to uncover something much bigger. Sophie paced the living room, her heart pounding as she waited for Michael Carter to arrive. The weight of what she had just discovered sat heavy in her chest. If she was right, if Judge Reynolds had done this before, then this wasn't just about her dad anymore. This was about justice. A knock at the door made her jump. Her mother rushed to open it, her face still tight with worry. Michael stepped inside, looking alert but controlled, his lawyer instincts fully engaged. His eyes flicked to Sophie. "All right, tell me everything." Sophie led him to the table, her laptop open, the screen glowing with the old case files. "Look at this," she said, pointing at the documents. 5 years ago, another employee, David Langston, was accused of embezzlement. The evidence against him was suspiciously similar to what they're using against my dad. Same missing funds, same kind of witness testimonies, even the same forensic accountant giving testimony. And the judge? She tapped the screen. "Reynolds." Michael frowned, scanning the file. "That's unusual." "Not just unusual." Sophie pulled up another case. 3 years ago, another one. Lisa Brooks. Same story. Different company. Same kind of mistake in financial records. Same judge. Same result. Michael's brows furrowed. "And they were all convicted?" Sophie nodded. "Yes. And in every single case, they never found the money. It just disappeared." Michael's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "That's not a coincidence." Sophie exhaled sharply. "Exactly. I think someone is framing these people. And Judge Reynolds is helping them." Her mother let out a shaky breath. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "If this is true, then we're not just going up against a judge. We're going up against whoever is behind this." Michael leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Sophie, this is huge. But we can't just throw out accusations. We need solid proof." Sophie nodded. "That's why I called you." Michael thought for a moment before speaking. "Okay, first step, we need to find patterns. Who benefited from these convictions? Was it the companies? The lawyers? Someone else? And we need to find someone who's willing to talk." Sophie's mind raced. "What about the people who were convicted?" Michael's face darkened. "Most of them are in prison." Silence filled the room. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. These people had lost everything, just like her dad was about to. "We need to find a way to talk to them," she said. Michael hesitated, then nodded. "I might be able to arrange something. But it won't be easy." He exhaled. "And Sophie, if you do this, you'll be making enemies. Powerful ones." Sophie clenched her fists. "I don't care. I just want my dad back." Michael studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right, let's get to work." The next morning, Sophie sat in her father's empty chair at the breakfast table. The house felt eerily quiet without him. Her mom moved around the kitchen in a daze, barely eating, barely speaking. Sophie's phone buzzed. "Michael, meet me at my office. I found something." She grabbed her bag. "Mom, I need to go." Her mother gave her a tired look. "Be careful." Sophie nodded and hurried out the door. Michael's office was small but packed with papers, books, and case files. He waved Sophie inside, closing the door behind her. "I did some digging," he said, handing her a folder. "David Langston, the guy from the first case? His wife has been trying to get someone to reopen his case for years." Sophie's eyes widened. "She thinks he was framed?" "She knows he was framed," Michael corrected. "I called her this morning. She agreed to meet with us." Sophie's pulse quickened. "When?" Michael checked his watch. "Now." They met Jennifer Langston at a small cafe on the edge of town. She was a woman in her early 50s, her eyes tired, her hands wringing together as she sipped her coffee. "You're the girl trying to fight Judge Reynolds?" she asked, looking Sophie over. Sophie nodded. "I think he framed my dad, just like he did to your husband." Jennifer's breath hitched. She blinked hard, then reached into her bag, pulling out a thick folder. "I've been keeping records, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen." Sophie took the folder and flipped through the pages. Old emails, court transcripts, financial reports. And then she saw it. A check. A check for a large amount of money, made out to Judge Reynolds. Her heart stopped. "This," she whispered. "This is proof." Michael leaned over, scanning the document. His face paled. "It's a payment. And the sender." He pointed to the company name. "This is the same company that accused your father." Sophie felt a rush of cold spread through her body. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. Judge Reynolds was being paid off. Jennifer's hands trembled. "I tried to show this to people, but no one believed me. No one would listen." Sophie looked up, determination burning in her eyes. "We're listening." Jennifer exhaled shakily, nodding. "Then take it, and stop him before he ruins another life." Sophie clenched the folder in her hands. Now, they had proof. But the real battle was just beginning. And Judge Reynolds wasn't going to go down without a fight. Sophie gripped the folder tightly as she and Michael stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the evidence in her hands sent an electric thrill through her nerves. They had proof, real proof, that Judge Reynolds was involved in something corrupt. But the momentary victory was overshadowed by a creeping sense of danger. Michael opened the car door for her. "We need to be smart about this," he said as she climbed in. "If Reynolds is dirty, he's not working alone. Exposing him could put you and your family at risk." Sophie swallowed hard. "I don't care." Michael gave her a sharp look. "You should care. This isn't just some school project, Sophie. This is real life. These people, whoever they are, have money, power, and influence. If they find out we have this, they won't just sit back and let it happen." Sophie knew he was right. She was scared, but she wouldn't back down now. She looked at the folder in her lap. "What do we do next?" Michael tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, thinking. "We need someone who can verify this document. A forensic accountant or an investigator who can prove this check isn't just some coincidence." Sophie frowned. "But won't they be scared to go against a judge?" Michael hesitated, then sighed. "Most would be." Silence filled the car for a moment before Sophie spoke again. "Then we need to find someone who isn't afraid." Michael sighed again, shaking his head. "I might know a guy." An hour later, they pulled up to a rundown office building on the outskirts of town. The sign on the door read, "Jack Calloway, Private Investigator." Michael turned to Sophie. "Jack used to work for the FBI. He left under complicated circumstances. But if anyone can dig into this, it's him." Sophie nodded, gripping the folder tightly as they stepped inside. The office smelled of old coffee and cigarette smoke. Papers were stacked in messy piles on every surface. A grizzled man in his late 50s sat behind the desk, his salt and pepper beard unshaven, his eyes sharp as they flicked up to Michael. Well, Jack said with a smirk. "Look who finally decided to visit. What do you want, Carter?" Michael smirked back. "Good to see you too, Jack." Jack's eyes landed on Sophie. "And who's the kid?" Sophie straightened her back. "Sophie Daniels." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Daniels? As in the guy on trial for embezzlement?" Michael nodded. "We think he was set up." Jack leaned back in his chair. "A lot of people think things. Doesn't mean they can prove it." Sophie stepped forward and placed the folder on his desk. "Then prove it." Jack looked at her for a long moment before opening the folder. His eyes scanned the documents, his smirk slowly fading. He sat up straighter. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Michael crossed his arms. "It's real, isn't it?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He pulled a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and studied the check closely. Then he picked up a pen and tapped it against his desk. "This check was laundered through 3 different companies before landing in Reynolds' pocket," he said. "That's a classic money-cleaning operation." Sophie's stomach turned. "So this isn't just about my dad?" Jack exhaled. "No, this is big." Michael frowned. "How big?" Jack rubbed his jaw. "Let's just say, if this goes public, Reynolds isn't the only one who'll go down. Whoever is behind this, corporate executives, politicians, maybe even law enforcement, will do anything to keep it quiet." Sophie clenched her fists. "Then we have to expose them." Jack chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Kid, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Michael placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "That's why we need your help." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine. But if we do this, we do it my way. No rushing in, no tipping them off. We need solid proof before we make a move." Sophie nodded. "Deal." Jack smirked. "All right, kid. Let's take down a corrupt judge." That night, Sophie returned home exhausted. Her mom was sitting on the couch, staring at the muted television. When Sophie walked in, her mother turned to her with worried eyes. "Sophie, what are you getting yourself into?" Sophie sat beside her. "Mom, I know this is dangerous, but I have to do this." Her mom's hands shook as she reached for Sophie's. "I can't lose you too." Sophie squeezed her mother's hand. "You won't." Her mom sighed, then pulled her into a tight hug. "Just promise me one thing." Sophie nodded. "Anything." Her mom pulled back and looked her in the eyes. "Be careful." Sophie swallowed hard. "I promise." But deep down, she knew careful might not be enough. The next day, Sophie walked into the courthouse, ready for the next hearing. She kept her head high as she passed Judge Reynolds in the hallway. He stopped, giving her a smug look. "Miss Daniels, I hope you've finally come to your senses." Sophie met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Oh, I have," she said, smiling. "And so will everyone else soon enough." For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in Reynolds' eyes. Not arrogance, not mockery, fear. But before either of them could say anything else, a man in a dark suit stepped up beside the judge and whispered something in his ear. Reynolds' smirk returned. He leaned in close to Sophie and whispered, "You have no idea what you've just done." And then he walked away. Sophie's blood ran cold. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Sophie's skin prickled as she watched Judge Reynolds disappear down the hallway. His last words echoed in her mind. "You have no idea what you've just done." A shiver ran down her spine. Something was coming, and it wasn't good. She forced herself to keep walking toward the courtroom. Her dad needed her to stay strong. No matter what game Reynolds was playing, she wasn't backing down. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew something was very wrong. Her mother sat in the front row, her face pale. Next to her, Michael looked tense, gripping the edge of the table. Jack Calloway was nowhere to be seen. Sophie hurried over. "What's going on?" Michael leaned in, lowering his voice. The prosecution just added a new witness. Sophie frowned. "So? That's normal, right?" Michael clenched his jaw. "Not this witness." He slid a paper in front of her. Sophie's stomach dropped when she saw the name. Jack Calloway. Her head snapped up. "No, that's not possible. Jack's on our side." Michael exhaled. "Apparently, he's not anymore." Before Sophie could respond, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Reynolds." Sophie felt her blood boil as Reynolds took his seat, his expression smug. He adjusted his robe and glanced at her with amusement. She could practically see the victory in his eyes. "Prosecution may call its next witness," Reynolds announced. The door opened, and Sophie's stomach twisted into knots as Jack Calloway walked to the stand. He didn't look at her, didn't even glance in her direction. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and then sat down, facing the prosecution. Sophie's head spun. What was happening? Why would Jack testify against them? The prosecutor approached the stand. "Mr. Calloway, can you confirm your occupation?" Jack's voice was steady. "Private investigator." "And how long have you been in this field?" "Over 20 years. The prosecutor nodded. "And in that time, have you come across cases involving financial fraud?" "Yes." The prosecutor took a slow step closer. "And in your professional opinion, does the evidence in this case suggest that the defendant, Henry Daniels, embezzled company funds?" Sophie clenched her fists. "No. Say no. Say no." Jack hesitated. For just a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked toward her. And then, "Yes." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The courtroom murmured in shock. Michael's hand slammed against the table. "Objection." Judge Reynolds smirked. "Overruled." Michael shot to his feet. "Your Honor, Mr. Calloway was working with the defense before today." Reynolds cut him off. "And yet here he is, testifying for the prosecution. If your investigator had a sudden change of heart, that's your problem, Mr. Carter." Michael gritted his teeth, but sat down. Sophie's world spun. Jack lied. Why? What had changed? And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A man in a dark suit, standing near the back of the courtroom. Watching. Waiting. A cold realization hit her. Jack hadn't betrayed them because he wanted to. He had been forced. Sophie's heart pounded. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a war. And Judge Reynolds was playing dirty. An hour later, Sophie stormed out of the courthouse, Michael right behind her. "I knew something was wrong," she shouted. That wasn't Jack talking. That was fear. Michael rubbed his forehead. "I know. But right now, that doesn't change the fact that his testimony wrecked our case." Sophie turned to him, desperation in her voice. "We have to talk to him. Jack wouldn't do this unless someone, forced him to." Michael sighed but nodded. "I'll see if I can find him." Just then, Sophie's phone buzzed. A message. "Unknown number. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Her breath hitched. She spun around, scanning the street. Cars. Pedestrians. A sea of people. But somewhere among them, someone was watching. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just about her dad anymore. Whoever was behind this was making sure she knew they were watching. Sophie tightened her grip on her phone. If they thought a threat would scare her off, they were wrong. Because now, she was more determined than ever. Sophie stared at the message on her phone, her heart pounding. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." She swallowed hard and looked around again. Nothing seemed out of place, just people going about their day, cars honking, and distant voices chatting. But she knew someone was there, watching. Michael leaned over, reading the message. His face darkened. "Sophie, we need to be careful. This isn't just legal corruption. Whoever is behind this isn't afraid to threaten a teenager." Sophie clenched her jaw. Good. That means they're scared. Michael exhaled sharply. Scared people do reckless things. She ignored him and typed back. Sophie, nice try. But I'm not stopping. She hit send before Michael could stop her. His eyes widened. Sophie, I'm not backing down, Michael. She shoved her phone into her pocket. They want to scare me? Let them try. Michael rubbed his temples. You're braver than most lawyers I know. But bravery won't protect you if these people really decide to act. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You're making a mistake. And then, a second message. Unknown number. Check your front door. Sophie's blood ran cold. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned and sprinted toward the parking lot. Michael cursed and ran after her. They reached her house in record time. Her mother was inside, but the front porch looked untouched. No sign of anyone. Until she looked down. Sitting on the welcome mat was a small manila envelope. Sophie's hands shook as she picked it up. Michael grabbed her wrist. Wait. It could be dangerous. Sophie ignored him and ripped it open. Inside was a single photograph. She gasped. It was a picture of her, walking to school, books in her arms. Someone had taken it from a distance. A chill ran through her. This wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. Michael took the picture and swore under his breath. Sophie, this is serious. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to think. They wouldn't send this if they didn't have something to lose. We're close to finding the truth. Michael's face was grim. Yeah. And now they're letting you know they can reach you anytime. Her mother walked onto the porch, her face tightening when she saw the fear in Sophie's eyes. What's going on? Sophie quickly hid the photo behind her back. Nothing, Mom. Her mother frowned. I may be struggling right now, but I'm not blind, Sophie. Tell me what's happening. Sophie hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to scare her mom more than she already was. But lying wouldn't help either. She took a deep breath. Mom, someone is trying to scare me away from the case. Her mother paled. What do you mean? Michael held up the empty envelope. Threats. Surveillance. And now this. He handed her the photo. Her mother's fingers trembled as she took it. When she saw Sophie's image, she gasped and covered her mouth. No, she whispered. This is not happening. Sophie grabbed her mom's hands. Mom, listen to me. They want us to panic. They want us to stop. But if we stop now, Dad loses. We lose. And they keep getting away with it. Tears welled in her mother's eyes. But Sophie, what if something happens to you? Sophie's chest tightened. She had been so focused on proving her dad's innocence that she hadn't let herself consider the danger. But now, with her mom looking at her like that, she realized. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. Michael stepped forward. We need to take precautions. I can make some calls, get security cameras set up. But Sophie, you have to be smart about this. Sophie nodded, her heart still pounding. We keep going. But we're careful. Her mother wiped her eyes. If anything happens to you, I won't forgive myself. Sophie hugged her tightly. Nothing's going to happen. I promise. But as she held her mother close, she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince her or herself. That night, Sophie lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed again. For a moment, she didn't want to look, but she forced herself to. Unknown number. Last warning. Walk away. Sophie's hands curled into fists. She tapped out a reply. Sophie, see you in court. She hit send. And somewhere in the darkness, she knew someone was watching. Waiting. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Sophie barely tasted her breakfast. The weight of everything, her dad's trial, the threats, Judge Reynolds' corruption, pressed down on her like a crushing force. She wasn't afraid of standing up for what was right, but she was afraid of what might happen to the people she loved. Her mom hadn't slept much either. She hovered around the kitchen, pretending to clean, but really just watching Sophie. The worry in her eyes was impossible to ignore. I can't let them win, Mom, Sophie said softly. Her mother sighed, running a hand through her hair. I know, sweetheart. She shook her head. I just wish I could protect you. Sophie reached for her hand. You are protecting me. By believing in me. By believing in Dad. Her mom's eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded. Then I'll be strong for you. A knock at the door made them both jump. Sophie's heart pounded as she rushed to open it. Michael stood there, his expression grim. You need to see this, he said. Sophie grabbed her bag, kissed her mom on the cheek, and followed him out the door. They sat in Michael's car as he handed her a file. Jack's missing, he said. Sophie's eyes widened. What? Michael nodded toward the file. I tried to call him all night. No answer. So I checked his office this morning. Sophie flipped through the photos inside. Jack's office had been trashed. Papers were scattered everywhere. His desk drawers had been ripped open. The computer was gone. He didn't just disappear, Sophie whispered. Someone made him disappear. Michael exhaled. Exactly. And whoever did this wanted to make sure he couldn't help us. Sophie's mind raced. This wasn't just a cover-up anymore. This was dangerous. She set the file down, her hands shaking. Michael, we need to find him. Michael stared at the dashboard. I already put out some feelers. But if whoever's behind this has power over judges, they might have power over law enforcement too. Sophie clenched her fists. We have to move fast. If they got to Jack, that means they're getting desperate. Michael tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. You know what that also means. Sophie swallowed hard. That we're getting close. Michael nodded. Exactly. The courtroom was packed when Sophie arrived. The tension in the air was thick, every whisper carrying weight. She saw the prosecution's table crowded with attorneys, all smug and confident. Judge Reynolds sat at his bench, looking as arrogant as ever. But when he saw Sophie, his smirk faltered for just a second. She met his gaze head-on. She wanted him to know she wasn't scared. The bailiff called the court to order, and the prosecution's lead attorney stood. Your Honor, given the new testimony from Mr. Calloway, we'd like to submit an updated motion against the defense. Sophie's stomach turned. Jack's false testimony was about to make things worse for her dad. Michael stood. Objection. The defense has reason to believe Mr. Calloway's testimony was coerced. Judge Reynolds laughed. Coerced? That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. Do you have proof? Michael hesitated. Sophie's hands curled into fists. Not yet. Reynolds smirked. I thought so. Overruled. The prosecutor continued. With Mr. Calloway's new statement, we believe the evidence is even stronger against the defendant. We request an expedited ruling. Sophie's heart stopped. Michael shot to his feet. Absolutely not. The defense has every right to continue its investigation. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel, his smirk widening. Denied. Sophie couldn't believe it. They weren't even pretending to be fair anymore. Her father sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded in his lap. But Sophie saw the pain in his eyes. He knew. They all knew. This case had never been about justice. It was about power. Sophie stood. Your Honor, may I approach? The courtroom went silent. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. Sophie walked forward, standing right in front of him. I want to ask you something. Right here. Right now. The judge looked amused. I don't typically allow children to interrupt my proceedings, Miss Daniels. Sophie's voice was steady. Then answer me this. If you truly believe my father is guilty, why are you so afraid of letting us find the truth? The room froze. Reynolds' face darkened. Watch yourself, young lady. Sophie didn't blink. Oh, I am watching. And so is everyone else in this courtroom. Reynolds' jaw tightened. And for the first time, Sophie saw something new in his eyes. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. Before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. A uniformed officer rushed inside, whispering something to the bailiff. The bailiff's expression shifted. Your Honor, there's been a development. Reynolds' face twitched. What kind of development? The bailiff hesitated, then leaned in, whispering something. Reynolds' knuckles whitened against the gavel. Sophie watched him carefully. Something was wrong. Finally, Reynolds cleared his throat and turned to the courtroom. We're adjourning for the day. Court will reconvene tomorrow. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Sophie's heart raced. What just happened? But before she could figure it out, Reynolds slammed his gavel down and hurried out of the room. Michael leaned in. Sophie, what did we just witness? Sophie swallowed hard. I don't know. But whatever it was, it had shaken Judge Reynolds. And that meant they were finally close to the truth. Sophie could barely keep up as she and Michael rushed out of the courtroom. Judge Reynolds had run. The powerful, arrogant judge who had mocked her, threatened her, and twisted the system in his favor, ran. Something had shaken him. Something big. Michael grabbed Sophie's arm as they made their way through the crowded hall. We need to find out what just happened. Sophie nodded, her mind racing. The bailiff whispered something to him. Whatever it was, he panicked. Michael frowned. If Reynolds is panicking, it means something just slipped out of his control. Sophie's phone buzzed. She pulled it out and froze. A text message. Unknown number. They found him. Her stomach clenched. Michael looked at her face. Sophie? What is it? She showed him the message. Michael cursed under his breath. Who sent this? I don't know. Sophie's hands were trembling. Michael, I think they found Jack. Michael grabbed his keys. Let's go. They sped through town, Sophie gripping the door handle as Michael pushed the speed limit. Where do we even look? She asked, trying to steady her nerves. Michael's jaw was tight. If someone sent that message, it means they want us to find him. That means it's public. He pulled out his phone and did a quick search. His face went pale. Sophie. He turned the phone toward her. The screen showed a breaking news alert. Unidentified man found unconscious near abandoned warehouse. Authorities investigating possible foul play. Sophie's breath caught. That's him. Michael floored the gas. They arrived at the scene 20 minutes later. The warehouse loomed in the distance, old and rusted, like a forgotten skeleton. Police cars surrounded the area, their flashing lights painting the walls in red and blue. Sophie's chest tightened as she and Michael stepped out of the car. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the crime scene tape. Reporters whispered to one another, taking notes, snapping photos. Sophie grabbed Michael's arm. We have to get closer. Michael sighed. We can't just walk past the cops. Sophie's mind raced. She spotted a group of paramedics wheeling a stretcher toward an ambulance. The man on it was covered with a blanket, his face barely visible. But Sophie recognized him immediately. Jack! She rushed forward. A police officer stepped in her way. Miss, you can't be here. Sophie's hands clenched. That's my investigator. The officer frowned. You know this man? Michael stepped in. We're his legal associates. He was working on a case for us. We need to know if he's okay. The officer hesitated, then exhaled. He's alive. Barely. Sophie's stomach turned. What happened? The officer lowered his voice. We don't know yet. He was found inside the warehouse, unconscious. No ID, no phone, nothing. Whoever left him there didn't want him talking. Sophie's hands went cold. Michael asked, Can we see him? The officer shook his head. He's being taken to the hospital now. But if you're his legal team, you might be able to talk to him when he wakes up. Sophie turned to Michael. We have to go. Michael nodded. Let's move. At the hospital, Jack Calloway lay in a hospital bed, bandages wrapped around his head and arms. His face was bruised, his breathing uneven. Sophie's chest tightened. Jack! Michael pulled up a chair. We need to know what happened. Jack's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused at first, then sharpened when he saw Sophie. He swallowed hard. Kid. His voice was weak, hoarse. Sophie leaned in. Jack, who did this to you? Jack's fingers twitched against the blanket. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely above a whisper. Michael pulled out his phone. Here, type it. He handed it to Jack. Jack's trembling fingers moved across the screen, slowly typing out a single word. Sophie's heart stopped when she read it. Reynolds. Michael's eyes widened. The judge. Jack gave a small nod. Sophie felt ice run through her veins. Jack, what happened? She whispered. Jack took a shaky breath. They came to my office. Told me to lie in court. When I refused, they took me. He swallowed. Said if I didn't say what they wanted, I wouldn't make it out. Michael cursed under his breath. Sophie felt her pulse hammering. Jack, we can expose them. But we need evidence. Jack closed his eyes, struggling to stay awake. Check my office. Hidden drawer, bottom cabinet. Sophie nodded. We'll find it. Jack's eyes opened again, locking onto hers. Be careful, kid. His eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted into unconsciousness again. Michael stood. We need to get to his office. Now. Sophie swallowed hard and nodded. If Jack had hidden something, it might be their only shot at taking Reynolds down. But deep down, she knew, if Reynolds found out what they were up to, he wouldn't let them walk away this time. The night air was thick as Sophie and Michael pulled up to Jack's office. The building was dark, its windows reflecting the glow of the streetlights. Sophie's heart pounded as she gripped the car door handle. Are you sure about this? Michael asked. Sophie nodded. If Jack hid something, we need to find it before they do. Michael exhaled. All right, but we're in and out. No hero moves. They stepped out of the car, moving quickly toward the entrance. The glass door was locked. Michael jiggled the handle, then pulled out a small set of tools from his pocket. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Michael smirked. You think lawyers don't pick up a few tricks? Within seconds, the lock clicked open. They slipped inside, locking the door behind them. The office smelled like dust and stale coffee. Papers were still scattered from when Jack had been taken. Sophie's stomach twisted. He had been dragged out of here, threatened, beaten, and still, he tried to warn them. She moved toward Jack's desk, crouching down to check the bottom cabinet. Her fingers ran along the wooden paneling, feeling for anything unusual. Then, a slight gap. She pressed against it, and a small panel popped open. Sophie's breath caught as she reached inside and pulled out a worn leather folder. Michael knelt beside her. That's it. She flipped it open. Inside were pages and pages of documents, financial records, court transcripts, even emails. Sophie's eyes widened. This is everything. Michael scanned a page. This shows direct payments from companies to Judge Reynolds. And look, he pointed to a list of names. These are the other people Reynolds convicted. He's been running this scam for years. Sophie's fingers tightened on the pages. We have him. A loud thump sounded from outside. They both froze. Michael whispered, we need to go. Now. Sophie shoved the folder into her backpack. They stood, moving toward the door as quietly as possible. Another noise. Footsteps. Michael grabbed her wrist. Back way. They rushed toward the rear exit, Michael pulling open the door, and stopped cold. A man in a dark suit stood waiting. He smiled. Going somewhere. Michael immediately stepped in front of Sophie. Sophie's heart pounded. This was bad. The man's voice was calm. Hand over the folder. Michael's jaw clenched. Not happening. The man sighed, shaking his head. I was hoping you'd cooperate. A second man stepped out of the shadows. And he had a gun. Sophie's breath hitched. Michael's voice was tight. Sophie, run. The man with the gun smirked. She won't get far. Sophie's mind raced. If they handed over the folder, everything would be gone. If they didn't. Michael took a slow step forward. You really want to do this? You think shooting two people outside a private investigator's office is going to go unnoticed? The gunman hesitated. Michael pressed. You think Reynolds will protect you if you botch this? He's panicking. He ran out of court today. He knows it's over. The gunman's grip on the weapon faltered. Michael took another step. We already have the evidence. You think taking this from us will stop what's coming? Sophie's heart pounded. Michael was bluffing, but it was working. The men exchanged a look. Then the one with the gun muttered, forget it. He shoved his weapon back into his coat. This is your last warning. Walk away. The other man added. Or next time, we don't ask. They turned and disappeared into the shadows. Sophie barely realized she was shaking. Michael exhaled. Let's get the hell out of here. Back at Sophie's house, they spread the documents across the kitchen table. Her mother paced, her face pale. They pulled a gun on you? Michael sighed. Yeah. Her mom turned to Sophie, tears in her eyes. This is getting too dangerous. Sophie reached for her hand. Mom, we have everything we need to stop them. Michael nodded. We can take this to the press. If we leak this before Reynolds can cover it up, he's finished. Sophie's mom looked between them. Then, finally, she nodded. Then let's end this. Sophie smiled softly. Together. The next morning, the headlines hit. Corrupt judge exposed. Secret payments uncovered. Judge Reynolds linked to fraud conspiracy. Witness breaks silence. I was forced to lie in court. By noon, the courthouse was in chaos. Sophie stood outside with Michael and her mother, watching as news crews swarmed the building. Then, the doors opened, and out stepped Judge Reynolds. But this time, he wasn't in his robe. He was in handcuffs. Sophie's breath caught as officers led him to a waiting police car. He glanced up, his eyes locking onto hers. Pure rage. But behind it, fear. Michael exhaled. We did it. Tears pricked Sophie's eyes. We really did. Her mother hugged her tightly. And for the first time in weeks, she breathed. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Sophie watched Judge Reynolds being led into the police car, his face twisted in rage. She had won. The courtroom that once felt like a battleground was now a spectacle for the entire world to see. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and legal analysts speculated on how deep Reynolds' corruption ran. But Sophie? She just felt relief. Michael let out a long breath beside her. I almost can't believe it. Sophie clenched her fists, watching as the police car pulled away. Believe it. It's over. Her mother squeezed her shoulder, smiling through her tears. I am so proud of you, Sophie. Sophie smiled, but there was still one last thing left to do. Dad, she whispered. Michael nodded. Come on. Let's go bring him home. The courtroom was silent. Sophie sat beside Michael at the defense table as the judge, a new, uncorrupted one, looked over the case. The state had no choice but to drop the charges. The entire case against her father had been built on lies, threats, and fabricated evidence. And now, it was crumbling. The judge cleared his throat. The prosecution has submitted a motion to dismiss all charges against Henry Daniels, citing newly uncovered misconduct. Sophie's breath caught. The judge turned to her father, who sat straight-backed, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Daniels, you are hereby cleared of all charges. You are free to go." Sophie let out a shaky breath. She turned to her dad, and in an instant, she was in his arms. Her mother joined them, crying softly against his shoulder. Her father whispered, "I knew you'd save me." Sophie smiled through her tears. "I promised I would." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but she didn't care. The fight was over. Her father was free. Michael patted her back. "You did it, kid." She turned to him, wiping her eyes. "We did it." Michael grinned. "Yeah, but let's be honest, you stole the show." Sophie laughed. For the first time in weeks, she truly felt it. Peace. The headlines didn't stop for days. Teen legal genius takes down corrupt judge. Brave young girl fights for justice and wins. Sophie Daniels, the girl who changed the system. People wanted interviews. Schools wanted her to speak. Some even suggested she should study law early. Sophie, however, just wanted normal again. But something had changed in her. She had walked into a courtroom as a quiet girl who barely spoke. And she had walked out a fighter. A week later, she sat at the kitchen table, her dad sipping coffee beside her. He glanced at her over the rim of his mug. "So, law school?" Sophie chuckled. "Maybe. Eventually." Her dad smiled. "No rush. But I have a feeling the world hasn't seen the last of you in a courtroom." Sophie smirked. "Not if I can help it." Her mother laughed, shaking her head. "Just promise me next time you take down a corrupt system, you won't almost get killed." Sophie grinned. "No promises." They laughed, the warmth of their home finally returning. Michael knocked on the door, stepping inside. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Sophie rolled her eyes. "When do you ever knock?" Michael smirked, handing her a folder. "Figured you'd want to see this." Sophie opened it, scanning the pages. It was a letter from the legal board, an official acknowledgement of Judge Reynolds' corruption. His rulings, including those against other innocent people, were being overturned. Justice was being restored. Sophie exhaled. "We didn't just save Dad." Michael nodded. "Nope. You changed everything." Her father squeezed her hand. "I always knew you were special, kiddo." Sophie smiled. "Turns out, I just needed a reason to show it." As she sat there, surrounded by her family, the battle finally behind her, Sophie realized something. The world wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. It wasn't always right. But sometimes, just sometimes, one person could make a difference. And she had. The air felt lighter. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie could finally breathe. The battle was over, and the war had been won. Her father was free. Judge Reynolds was in prison. And justice had prevailed, not because of wealth, not because of power, but because she refused to give up. As she sat in her family's kitchen, flipping through the letter confirming that Reynolds' rulings were being overturned, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Michael leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So what now, kid?" Sophie shrugged. "Back to normal, I guess." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You think after all this, life is just going to go back to normal?" Sophie chuckled. "I can hope." Her father sipped his coffee, watching her with pride. "Normal is overrated. Besides, if you ever change your mind about law school, I think you've got a head start." Sophie rolled her eyes. "One battle at a time, Dad." Her mother sat down beside her, brushing a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. "Sweetheart, I know this wasn't easy. You were up against people who had all the power, and you still won. But if I've learned anything from this," she smiled softly, "it's that you're capable of anything." Sophie's throat tightened. She had fought for her dad, for justice, for the truth. And somehow, she had come out the other side stronger than she ever thought possible. Michael leaned in, lowering his voice dramatically. "So, no interest in becoming a full-time crime fighter?" Sophie smirked. "I think I'll take a break from the life-threatening cases for a while." Michael grinned. "Smart call." Her father exhaled, his eyes full of warmth. "I'm just happy to be home." Sophie reached for his hand. "We are too." The house was filled with the kind of laughter that had been missing for too long. The kind of laughter that said, "We made it." The news continued to buzz about her story, about how a teenage girl had taken down a corrupt judge. Some called her a legal prodigy. Others called her fearless. But to Sophie, she was just a girl who refused to let the world be unfair. She glanced down at the letter in her hands one last time before setting it aside. She had done what she set out to do. And now? Now it was time to just live. The sun streamed through the window, warm and golden. And for the first time in weeks, Sophie Daniels let herself smile. Because this was her victory. And this was the end.